Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this video lesson about civil rights. This is part one of several video lessons about this topic, this very essential, important topic. So without further ado, let's get started. So, all right, let me move my little camera guy there. Okay, so these are some key vocab that I want you to keep in mind. These are all things we're going to be talking about. Some will go into deep detail in this video lesson. Others will be covered in greater detail in the later civil rights video lessons. But these are important key ideas you are going to need to know about, whether you're taking the AP exam or not. These are key ideas you should be aware of. Okay, so let's talk about exactly what civil rights are, right? So civil rights technically refers to those things that the government must do, and that is to provide equal protection and freedom from discrimination for all citizens. Technically, all people, whether citizen or not. The 14th Amendment makes mention of persons, not just citizens, but we'll get to that in just a second. So this is rooted in the 14th Amendment, which was one of three Reconstruction amendments. Okay, this was passed in the aftermath of the Civil War. All right, and it contains this important idea of the Equal Protection Clause. I'll get to that in just a second. But the core idea here that I want you to keep in mind is that people have rights to be treated without unreasonable or unconstitutional differences. That this notion of political equality is a core American value, or at least it's supposed to be, right? So this is the core idea of civil rights, okay? So here we go, is the 14th Amendment. So let's put that out there and let's take a look at this. So this is what it says. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Now, as you notice, or you should notice, I hope, it says person. It doesn't say citizen, doesn't say legal resident. It says person. That means human being. So anybody who is on U.S. territory is entitled to this. The 14th Amendment extends to all people. That's important to remember. Some people like to forget that. So before I go further, I actually want to give you like a very, very, very brief just civil rights timeline. Right now, again, I cannot possibly do justice to all of these items in a relatively short video lesson like this one. We're going to go into more detail about many of these things in the subsequent video lessons, and also my students and I are going to delve into this in class. If you're interested in this topic, I highly recommend taking specialized classes in it, or perhaps checking out other video lessons and other courses that will allow have that time to delve deeper into this. So the first part of this timeline over here starts with 1820. Now, let me just preface this by saying the issue of civil rights goes back long before 1820, right? We're talking about the very inception, at minimum, of our founding. But in terms of, for our purposes in the American government course, we're going to start very really briefly with 1820. Now, what happened in 1820? Well, this thing called the Missouri Compromise, right? And so there was this issue with there was about to be an imbalance of slave and free states in the United States. And so people were freaking out. So the Missouri Compromise was created in order to maintain that balance. Okay, the goal was to keep us from spilling over into open war, and it worked for a time. But as you can see in 1861, it stopped working after a while, and the southern states began seceding. Technically, it was December of 1860, with South Carolina being the first, but 1861, you have enough states that seceded that now we have the Confederacy and we have official open war. Okay, now, if you want more details on that, again, I suggest you consult other video lessons or other courses. But suffice to say that anybody who's going to look at you and say that the war was over, was fighting for states' rights, clearly hasn't read their history. All of the states that seceded clearly stated in their secession documents that they were fighting to defend the peculiar institution of slavery. Okay, they state it, right? We're not putting words in anybody's mouth. Go read the secession documents yourself. Okay, they clearly state that. So this war was about slavery. Now, in the aftermath, 1863, the Civil War is continuing on, and Abraham Lincoln is trying to sort of beat down the southern states and beat their momentum and just sort of make them so depressed that they give up. And he does this by issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, some folks in history would argue that Abraham Lincoln is the great emancipator. No, Okay, Abraham Lincoln freed slaves in all the rebelling states. The few states that had slaves but did not secede, they were exempt from the Emancipation Proclamation. So let's get the history correct here. Abraham Lincoln was not the great emancipator. He did make a wide variety of changes in his personal opinions and policies regarding Black Americans and regarding slavery. But let's not sugarcoat what it was. Lincoln did not free all the slaves. He was not the great emancipator. This was to stick it to the South. That's what the purpose of this Emancipation Proclamation was. In 1865, we finally get the end of the Civil War, and almost right after that, in the same year, 1865, we get the passage of the 13th Amendment. That abolishes slavery completely. We then have in 1868 the passage of the 14th Amendment, which we've talked about. We're going to talk about more. In 1870, the 15th Amendment. Okay, and that guarantees black male suffrage. Again, women wouldn't get the right to vote until much, much later, but in 1870, black males, via constitutional amendment, are guaranteed the right to vote. Now, that's all in theory, right? The Constitution says it, but government officials have to actually enforce it. So, unfortunately, which we're going to talk about, we have a lot of different legal state based initiatives that were passed by the southern states in an attempt to rebel against the freeing of former slaves. And we're going to talk about all those things. But in 1896, there was a very important Supreme Court case called Plessy v. Ferguson. And this is where the United States established the separate but equal doctrine. So this is where you get whites only water fountain, whites only bathrooms, whites only establishments. The fact that we were all segregated based on race. This went all the way into the schools, which brings us to our next key point in the timeline, 1954. 1954, the case called Brown versus Board of Education came to the court, and the court decided that separate but equal was inherently unequal and therefore unconstitutional. So the separate but equal doctrine was overturned. Now, if you really think about it, the separate but equal doctrine should never have been in effect given the 14th Amendment. But again, Supreme Court justices ruled based on their own personal opinions and not on the Constitution. This is why it's very important to pay attention who gets put on the bench. Okay. Also in 1954, Rosa Parks is arrested for refusing to give up her seat on the bus, and this led directly to the Montgomery bus boycott. And following up with that, in 1963, you have Martin Luther King Jr.'s, Dr. King's very famous I Have a Dream speech. And that was during the March on Washington in that year. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act is passed. That's a key piece of legislation. 1964, it's not pictured here, but the Civil Rights Act was passed. That's another important date. In 1976, Black History Month was officially established in February. And in 2003, the court ruled that race can be considered as one of many factors in college admissions, affirming or upholding affirmative action. So that is a very, very, very brief timeline of the civil rights movement in America. And here is yet another timeline. I'm not going to go through this one by one because we just went through the last one, but feel free to pause and take note of the key issues that and the key events that are listed here. This is the continuation of that timeline. Let me move my little guy maybe over. Whoops. Over there. So you guys can take notes on this and pause the video to do that, and we will continue. Here is yet again another timeline. I want to make sure that you are provided with the necessary historical context. Okay, in class we're going to talk about several of these items, and I'm curious which ones stand out to you and why. So please make a note of which events in these various timelines stand out to you. Here's the other side of that. Okay, so let's start in terms of digging down into the nitty gritty. This decision known as the Dred Scott decision in 1857. Now remember, this is pre-Civil War, and this is also before the passage of the Reconstruction Amendments. Okay, so the Supreme Court declared that blacks, whether they are free or slave, are not citizens. Therefore, they have no standing to sue. And that means that because they're not citizens, because they are not persons under the law, slaves cannot sue. Even if you're not slaves, even if you're free, a free black, you are not able to sue. It also ruled that Congress cannot legislate slavery What this case did was massively inflame tensions between the North and South, and it was one of many things that tipped the balance into bringing the country to civil war. So, Reconstruction. Now, I've talked about some of this already, but just to give you some historical context here, Reconstruction was the period after the Civil War where the nation attempted to come back together as one country. We had been two separate nations during the duration of this war. Now we're attempting to come back together. It is interesting to note that had Abraham Lincoln survived and not been assassinated right at the end of the Civil War, his plan for Reconstruction was very, very different than what actually ended up happening. It's an interesting what-if game to play to think about what might have happened if Lincoln's Reconstruction plan had gone through, as opposed to his, vice president, who then became president in the wake of his death, Andrew Johnson, had not been in control of it. Now, these Reconstruction amendments fundamentally changed the relationship between the states and the federal government. This fully affirmed supremacy of federal policy and federal law. Up until this point, there was a little bit of a debate over how much authority the federal government really had over the states. The Civil War settled it cold. Federal government is supreme. But the South resists. All right, they accept preserving the Union and abolishing slavery, but they cannot stomach granting legal and political rights to former slaves and free black people. They refuse to stomach it. So in the wake of the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction, various items are instituted. Jim Crow laws start getting passed, the black codes, barriers to voting like the white primary, poll taxes, literacy tests, things like that we'll talk about in more detail in a little bit. So, from black codes to Jim Crow. Now listen, this is, I marvel at how ignorant we are of our own history. The fact that this was allowed to persist it is unconscionable to me. All right, so known as neo-slavery, basically slavery in everything but name only. They called it something else, but it was, in fact, slavery. So this thing called sharecropping, where basically former masters would allow, right, newly freed slaves to stay on the land that they knew. And it's like, oh, okay, well, we'll pay you and you can, farm the land. But they created such restrictions that effectively these newly freed people were tied to the land via other legal means. So they effectively maintained the system of slavery without calling it slavery. Okay? Southern Jim Crow laws also encouraged massive segregation and degradation. Okay, Northern white leaders ignored this. They decided we're over it, we don't care anymore, we don't want to deal with it. The American public is sick of dealing with Reconstruction, and everybody forgot about it. Well, everybody. White people forgot about it. And the Supreme Court didn't help matters when they upheld segregation in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896. By the way, there's this interesting divide that people seem to think, oh, the South is all evil and bad, and they're the slave owners, and the North was this inherent good. There was plenty of discrimination, and a lot of black codes and Jim Crow regulations made it all the way up to the good old North, right? So don't think that this wasn't nationwide, because it was. Actually, out west, black people had a lot more freedom because it wasn't fully settled yet. In the North and South, there was enough discrimination to go around, unfortunately. So, early civil rights legislation, we did have some successes in Reconstruction. We did get the Civil Rights Act of 1865, right, and to 1875. But problem was that they were overturned. The civil rights cases that went to the court in 1883 overturned all of these acts of legislation because the court was packed by pro-slave, anti-integration folks. So they invalidated virtually all of the civil rights legislation. So there was a lot of progress made in the initial aftermath of the Civil War, and it was all destroyed, unfortunately. So now that brings us to the key concepts for American government. We have Plessy v. Ferguson, right? And I talked about this before. 1896 establishes the separate but equal doctrine. This contributed to and solidified segregation, particularly in the South. But I want you to understand this was present in the North as well. Don't think the North gets off scot-free. They got to pay the piper too. They engaged in quite a bit of discrimination. There were also voting barriers, and I mentioned these earlier, the white primary, the grandfather clause, poll taxes, literacy tests. All of these things were designed to prevent black people from voting, okay? Now, none of these things applied to white people. No, no white person had to deal with a grandfather clause, a poll tax, or a literacy test. This is a direct violation of the 14th Amendment, okay, because the laws were not equally applied. You want to have a grandfather clause, well, that's fine if it applies to everyone. But the problem was it didn't apply to white people. A illiterate white man could walk in and vote no problem. There was no literacy test for him. White supremacy was also upheld outside the law. So here, in this era of history, we're dealing with legal, government-backed discrimination and degradation. Okay, but on top of this, you also have social and cultural discrimination and degradation. So we're really battling this on all fronts at this point. The NAACP was established in 1909, and its goal was to use the courts to fight for equality, to continue to challenge these laws using legal means and to get them overturned by the courts. It would take a little while before we got some Supreme Court justices who were willing to look at the law, truly look at the law, and get rid of these inherently unequal policies. And that is it for part one. I hope you learned what you needed to, and I will see you in part two.